Today, I want to take a brief break from Missing 411 to talk about someone who I believe to be very credible, Robert Bob Lazar. You may recognize the name as an Area 51 physicist who went public with alien UFO information after he began to fear for his life. Yes, I know that that's technically incorrect and also an oversimplification, but we will get into all of the details as we progress through the video. For those of you wondering about the next Missing 411 video, especially considering my comments on the last upload where I say that there probably won't be any more, don't worry. More are coming. I fully intend to publish the rest of the material that I have, which goes clear to the end of the book. I admit I got a little burned out, but after my break, I feel like I can sprint to finish. Now, let's get back to Robert Lazar, who I will start calling Bob going forward, as that's what he appears to prefer to go by. I was first introduced to Bob's account of alien spacecraft after watching a video from Derek Van Shake, where Derek examines Bob's body language from his Joe Rogan interview, while also comparing it to interviews that Bob gave years earlier. The link to this video is in the description below, and I found it extremely interesting and I highly recommend it. The short version, and careful, I'm about to spoil the video for you if you're interested in watching it, is that Bob is being truthful. This is based on his congruent body language, his technical information that he gives, and the fact that his story has not changed much beyond what could be forgiven as failing memory. As I often do, I scrolled through the comments of the video to see what other people thought and found an interesting reply to a comment. For context, Bob is credited in the video for predicting the previously unknown element 115 on the periodic table. Bob claimed that this element 115 was part of a so-called island of stability, where this element was not radioactive at all and did not decay. Here is the comment talking about this. For those of you listening, I will quote it now. Quote, "The fact that he spoke of working on an element yet to be revealed, only to have it come out later and put into the periodic table of elements after over a decade, almost 15 years, of when he stated it, pretty much did it for me." And here's the relevant reply. Higher elements are always synthesized. It wasn't a great prediction and has a half-life of 0.65 seconds. Not the conjectured island of stability. If anything, its short half-life disproves his claim. After reading that, I thought, man, if that's true, then the whole story has to be incorrect. To understand why I thought that, we need the key points that Bob presents in his story. Let's examine Bob's claims. I've taken these claims from Bob's interviews as well as the website boblazar.com. Bob has many fascinating claims. The points I want to take a look at in particular are ones that I consider key points. That is, claims that I consider to be integral to Bob's account and, if true, go a long way to proving the validity of Bob's overall account or, conversely, if false, significantly damage Bob's credibility. I will do my best to represent both sides with as little bias as possible. I want to make it clear that even though I consider myself a skeptical person by nature, my current worldview does not conflict with the idea that the government is not always honest with us and that extraterrestrial life very likely exists. In other words, I'm not setting out to debunk Bob. I just want to know more about it. And with those disclaimers out of the way, here are the points that I'll be examining. 1. Bob Lazar worked as a physicist at Los Alamos. 2. He has degrees in physics at both Caltech and MIT. 3. Bob brought friends and family to observe the flights of alien spacecraft, which he accurately predicted. And 4. Bob predicted the existence of element 115, an element that does not exist on Earth, and went on to state that this element is stable and served as fuel for the spacecraft that he personally worked on. Let's start at the top and work our way down. So the first claim is Bob Lazar was a physicist at Los Alamos. The timeline goes something like this, as more information has come to light over time. So, first, Bob claimed that he was a physicist at Los Alamos Labs, but then Los Alamos claimed that there was no records of him ever having worked there. In response, Bob said that this was an attempt to make him appear as a, quote, non-person, close quote. Basically, the government was trying to scrub his existence from paper trails. This was either to discredit him or as a preparation to make him physically disappear. The telephone directory for Los Alamos surfaced later on, and it listed Bob Lazar. As a result, it's proven that he did indeed work there, and by extension, there was a cover-up to hide this fact. Since this was proven, that means that other missing records, such as his time at MIT and Caltech, are likely part of the same governmental cover-up. Let's examine these claims. Ultimately, we have to acknowledge a few points. First, Los Alamos has a reputation for performing classified experiments. As such, it could be argued that they would lie about current or former employees. This is a mark in favor of the supporters, as I agree that they could very well lie about this, and they have motive to do so. The point I want to focus on is the actual phone directory entry, as well as some interviews with people at Los Alamos. First, the entry. From what I've been able to dig up online, the entry in the Los Alamos directory was due to his employment as a film processor for an outside contractor, Kirk Mayer. Yes, I said film processor. I know that there is a news article which quotes Bob as stating that he is a physicist for the lab, but on the other hand, there is a U.S. federal bankruptcy court record in which he describes himself as a film processor. All that said, I've also seen sources stating that he was an electrician tech for a particle accelerator, which would sort of fall under the category of physicist in its own way. I have also found an interview that supposedly took place between a reporter, Mark Farmer, and an inside source who knew Bob Lazar from his time at Los Alamos. It backs up the idea that he was definitely not a physicist, as well as confirms that he was a film processor. Here are the highlights, but of course I will link the full interview below. And I do encourage you to read through it. Source. Yeah, well, he was bounced out of the lab because he was using government equipment quite extensively to work on his cars. So, Mark, that was the reason he lost his job? Source. They found out about that and said, "We'd like you to leave." And that's when he opened up the Photoshop. The interviewer also goes on to ask some probing questions into the age and gender of employees of the print shop, inferring that there's some sort of trafficking going on. When I first read this, it really seemed to come out of left field for me, but then I went on to read that Bob was convicted for pandering. Pandering is the legal term that in essence means pimping out women. And this conviction took place in 1990, which would have been after his employment at Los Alamos. Of course, the conviction and bankruptcy documents are a matter of public record, but the interview is a little less concrete since it not only depends on a witness, but also fails to reveal who the witness is due to the request that they remain anonymous. So the interview parts really turn into an easily fabricated affair if you choose to disbelieve Mark Farmer. But let's move on to the claims about his education. Claim. Bob Lazar graduated from both MIT and Caltech. Bob has stated a number of times that he has a master's in physics from both MIT and Caltech, or I guess more correctly, he has a physics degree from one of those schools and electronics degree in the other. The narrative is that the government has erased these degrees to discredit him. And as proof, Bob was able to give the names of professors that would vouch for his existence. There's not a lot to say here. Proponents believe that since Los Alamos denied the records of his working for them, and the records of even his birth were difficult to obtain, it shows a trend of records being erased. Let's review. Of course, if records were erased, then there's nothing to see here. It's interesting then that records do exist of Bob's attendance to Pierce Junior College, at least according to Stanton Friedman, an American physicist and UFO enthusiast. Glenn Campbell also seems to have physically gone to MIT to search the paper records. The idea being that while computer records could be altered or erased relatively easily, it could be far more difficult to doctor the paper records. Bob Lazar was nowhere to be found in those records. Now, the second claim that the government erased these records obviously is not a provable fact. It's kind of the crux of the matter. However, the two names that Bob gave led to the director of computing at Pierce College and to a high school teacher. Neither of these people ever worked at MIT or Caltech. Again, of course, this could just be failing memory. There's a lot of excuses why these names didn't lead to any professors at MIT or Caltech, like Bob said that they would. But then there's also the information that in the bankruptcy forms that Bob himself had to file, there was no mention of him having lived in or near Massachusetts. But let's move on. Claim: Bob brought friends and family to see the alien craft performing. Bob was aware from his time at S4 that there were spacecraft on the site and that they would be tested on Wednesdays, since that's when the traffic on the highway was lowest. He took his friends to see these aircraft tests during a time when he was suspended from S4, but still technically employed by them. In the interview, he explains that this is due to his wife cheating on him, which he was unaware of at the time, but the S4 officials knew of this because all of his phones had been tapped. His friends and family saw the aircraft as glowing orbs in the sky. Bob explains that this light is because of the energy that the craft is putting into the gravity distortion fields, which allows the craft to maneuver in the way that it does. Quote, "It's really a byproduct of how the craft operates. When it's emitting that much energy, the gas around the craft emits light. The same reason why a lightning bolt is visible." Close quote. His friends describe it as some sort of continuous explosion in the sky. At one point, they state that they actually moved behind the vehicles at one point as they were watching because they were afraid that the craft was literally going to explode. Guards caught them on their third trip to see the craft performing. Bob was taken into custody the next day by the base personnel and was interrogated, then informed that his wife was cheating on him. Bob states that this interrogation was just short of a threat on his life. And this is really where he decided that he needed to do something or he would be erased. Let's examine these claims. After looking into the story quite a bit, I found that the counter to the very real footage that exists is that of misidentification. And if you believe the skeptics, purposeful misidentification on the part of Bob. But why do people think this? Well, first we have to look at the explanation for why the craft glows. It's due to intense energy being dumped into the air around the ship. If that's the case, it sort of invalidates a previous statement made by Bob. He has stated in the past that due to the gravity field around the spacecraft, if you were under it, you wouldn't be able to see it because the gravity bends the light around the craft. If the light is bent around the craft to the point of making it invisible, then why does it still glow? Okay, well, let's call that a misspeak, or perhaps a failure to mention that while you couldn't see the craft itself, you could still see a glow. What's the other reason for the doubt? There is an alternate explanation to the bright, seemingly exploding lights in the sky. Particle beams. Now, I'll be the first to say that this sounds wacky. But is it wackier than alien spacecraft? Let's take a look at the supporting evidence for this admittedly crazy-sounding counterclaim. A beam of particles does not behave like things we're used to in everyday life. The particles travel for a while, mostly unimpeded, then dump all of their energy in a really short distance. You can calculate and control this so precisely that there are medical applications for burning tumors out of patients without having to do any invasive surgery at all. There are calculations in one of my sources that detail how powerful the particle beam would have to be, as well as a potential use for using such a thing. Immediately, I thought that, given the science fiction tropes, a particle beam would be some sort of energy weapon that could be used to fry the circuits, or pilots, right out of an enemy aircraft. Instead, it was proposed that these beams would be used as some sort of anti-radar tool. This is where I have to admit that I'm out of my depth as far as the science behind it goes, but a quick search does indicate that plasma, which is formed by these beams, interferes with radar. In fact, there is some research going into a plasma shielding for stealth bombers. It's also brought up that the heat of the plasma would also interfere with heat-based seeking systems. So what's the supporting evidence for this theory? Well, first off, S4 appears to have quite a lot of radar technology on site. Given the high number of radar installations at the site, it would be the best place to test radar interfering technology. It would also explain the erratic movements, the bright light akin to an explosion, and so on. Next, we consider Bob himself. What is it that he did? Sure, he's known for strapping jet engines to his bike and car, but he also is noted as having a particle accelerator in his bedroom. I've seen some sources state that if he did do any work for Los Alamos, it appears as though it was on particle-based technology. That said, I don't see a concrete source for the last claim, so that's more on the level of hearsay. Finally, we have an account from Mark Farmer, who took a telescope out to where Bob Lazar said the lights would be. I will quote directly from page 237 from the book Area 51, The Dreamland Chronicles by David Darlington. Open quote. I've seen two of them out there, Farmer divulged. One was a light that kept bouncing around, then just went away. The other was a colored, floating, glowing orb that popped up behind the jumbled mountains south of Groom Lake. It went straight up, then started jerking around and wobbling up and down, at times making right-angled or greater than right-angled turns, then sitting still in a rock-hard hover. It became distorted when it moved. Part of it lagged behind the main object, then the trailing edge would catch up. I had a Celestron 1200mm telescope, and I watched it for an hour and 45 minutes. It wasn't quite round. It was sort of squashed, and shimmering the whole time as if surrounded by some sort of field. It was crimson on top, blue-green on the bottom, and gold in the middle. I have no idea what it was. Close quote. Again, I'm going to have to appeal to commenters here to evaluate this claim, since I frankly don't know. The claim is that because particle beams dumps its energy in a very small place, it is possible for a beam like this to have a color gradient from top to bottom. To me personally, that makes more logical sense on the surface than a gradient being visible on an alien spacecraft bending light with a gravity field. But again, I'm no expert, so please feel free to correct me. And on the note of gravity, I have another sincere question for anyone more well-versed in the science of gravity than I am. The spacecraft supposedly maneuvers using 3 gravity generators located in the bottom of the craft. By rotating these generators around, it creates a sort of perpetual downhill that the craft falls into. More intense gravity means it goes faster, and even has a strange effect on space-time as to sort of shorten the distance between where the craft is going and where it is, neatly solving the faster-than-light travel as well. And so, here are a couple of my questions. First, if it travels using only gravity and no propulsion, then how does the craft ascend? That is, how does it travel vertically upwards in the air? Gravity, as I understand it, is an attractive force. Since gravity generators are in the bottom, and according to Bob, one points down to generate the lift, how does it suddenly repel the craft and force it upwards? Wouldn't it cause another downhill under the craft, firmly sinking it to the ground? Second, and again, because gravity is an attractive force, wouldn't it also pull in surrounding material, especially if the gravity involved is strong enough to fold space-time and reduce the distance between 2 points? I'm probably missing something here for the second point, but those were just the thoughts I had listening to the interviews. So again, and more succinctly, how does gravity repel the craft in order to make it ascend? And secondly, why doesn't surrounding material such as air, water, even the earth below it, not move towards the craft when it's in motion? Now we reach the final claim. Stable element 115 was used as the fuel on the craft. 1. The spacecraft's reactor is antimatter based. 2. Element 115 is stable. 3. The US government has hundreds of pounds of this material, of which Bob may or may not have stolen a couple pounds. 4. All of this occurred before 115 was ever synthesized on Earth. 5. This element is only possible on planets with higher gravity than Earth, or specifically in star systems with higher gravity than ours. Let's examine these claims. To me, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this is the proverbial smoking gun, the thing that makes all of this fall apart. First of all, as we understand it, antimatter is not created in the way that Bob describes, by smashing protons into element 115 to make an antiproton. And even if this is how antimatter was made, it still wouldn't work. How antimatter generators are proposed to work in sci-fi movies and literature requires the antimatter to already exist rather than be created on scene. That's because creating antimatter on site for use as an energy source requires you to put in about 1 billion times more energy into making the antimatter than is finally contained in its mass. Element 115, now called moscovium, is not stable and is in fact highly radioactive. Moscovium has a half-life of little more than half a second, which means that if you had 1,000 pounds of it, in less than a second, you'd only have 500 pounds. And this, by the way, the half-life of 0.65 seconds, is the most stable isotope ever made of 115. Initial versions lasted even less time. In response to this, Bob is quoted as saying, quote, "They just made a few atoms. We'll see what other isotopes they come up with. One of them, or more, will be stable and will have the exact properties that I said." Close quote. Well, is that claim backed up? It's been years since then. Well, current projections show that there is a theoretical isotope yet to be created that could have a much longer half-life of several seconds. This would then decay into an isotope of 112 called copernicium. Forgive me if I mispronounce that, which may be very stable with a half-life in the region of 1,200 years. I would like to mention, though, that this would mean that the mass isn't Moscovium anymore. This is something that Moscovium would decay into and is a different element. So, in short, no, current science does not back up this claim at all. As far as we know today, it is not possible for any Moscovium to be present for very long. So, how would the government have any amount? Well, it is possible that eventually there will be an isotope that is created that is stable, and that all of our projections are wrong. But that's just not what's backed up by science at this moment. As for predicting its existence, 115 could have been predicted at that time in the same way that I can predict that there will eventually be an element 120. New elements are being synthesized all the time, even if it is just a few atoms. And as for the last claim about gravity being a necessity in this element existing, current stars or their size do not affect what elements are present in planets. Elements, especially super heavy ones such as Moscovium, or uranium for that matter, would only be created and dispersed into planets through supernovas, that is, exploding stars. Current stars have no bearing on elements existing in their solar systems, nor would gravity, as far as I'm aware, affect the half-life of elements. So where does this leave us? Well, the people on Bob's side will ask the very valid question of, why would Bob Lazar lie? For what possible gain? He doesn't want fame. He doesn't care if people believe him. He has gone on record saying that if he could do it all again, he would have just kept quiet and done his job. Well, as to him not having anything to gain, I beg to differ. First, if the particle beam theory is correct, he had an excellent reason to lie. That way, he could show off something cool to his friends, but also not technically violate his non-disclosure about what he was working on. At least, not to the degree that he would likely be prosecuted about it. After all, the government wouldn't want to admit to what it is that they were doing. As for gain, it's easy to say that you don't care if people believe you or not. He clearly is interested in fame, considering that he continues to do interviews, and he has also pursued ventures into jet-propelled vehicles, which has brought its own acclaim. I mean, if you're learning about UFOs and you discover a guy who's a major player in that department also has a jet car, which he does, wouldn't you check it out even if you wouldn't have otherwise? I know I did. I also thought it was interesting that in the segment that I saw, he draws a quick sketch of an alien craft, then he signs it. Like an artist. How much do you think these go for? Plus, there's another big game. If you are certain that there's a government conspiracy, I'm not even saying that you're wrong. My theory is that there is a government cover-up going on, but also that Bob Lazar is part of it. I think that Bob is spreading misinformation at the behest of the government in order to cover up what's actually going on there. It means that conspiracy theorists and skeptics are both correct, all without breaking any laws of physics or accepting the idea that aliens with this type of technology would somehow lose their tech to us. As I stated earlier, I'm not a physicist. I'm not a scientist. I just wanted to take a look at the story that compelled me to believe it and take a closer look at the specific claims. I'll be the first person to say that Bob Lazar is a very convincing person. As many have said, if he's lying, he deserves an Oscar. All I ask is a simple question. Which is more likely? That we have this alien technology, somehow, that runs on an element that would decay in seconds through a method that doesn't work and manipulates gravity in a way that defies how gravity works in every other situation, or that Bob is just a very convincing storyteller who chose to tell his friends, who he wanted to impress, that the lights in the sky were alien spacecraft, and he got caught. Then he was forced, under the threat of serious litigation or perhaps even through a payoff, to continue his story of alien craft rather than reveal what was actually going on at the site. All I'm asking is that you consider those two possibilities. I'd love to hear your own theories in the comments below. Thank you for your time.